Once upon a time smelling vaguely of barley stew and wool capes, roughly somewhere between a faltering Roman Empire and peasants inventing the concept of pants, there existed an unspoken code among parents, especially mothers. A code as ancient as bathhouses and as firm as badly baked medieval bread. This code stated, unofficially but unwaveringly, we do not explain marriage to daughters or anyone if we can help it. And you might ask, why? In your mind's eye, perhaps a sweet little girl named Mildred, or for the dramatic crowd, Ethel, sits by a rush-lit table, sucking thoughtfully on a parsnip, and finally builds the nerve to ask, Mum, what is marriage? At this question, her mother drops a pewter spoon into the soup, coughs into her apron, and answers, It's when people share a farm, dear. Then she swiftly changes the subject to oat yields and plague-resistant root vegetables. No further questions, please. This silence, this grand parental hush, didn't happen because they were heartless or shy. It happened because marriages, for more of history than we like to admit, were less about lambent love and long walks by the moat, and far more about goats, dowries, powerful alliances between the family who owned 3 acres of potato-suitable dirt and the family who had an extra oxen. Try explaining that to a 9-year-old in a nightgown. Good luck. In many parts of the medieval world, especially in Europe between the 10th and 17th centuries, think peasants to pompadours, marriage was a contract, a property shuffle, a transaction somewhere between a real estate deal and a livestock trade. A girl might know the name of her husband in advance, or not. Sometimes she'd get to meet him at the wedding. If she was lucky, he had most of his teeth and fewer than 5 debts. Marriage was not something you fell into romantically, but something you were quietly scooted into, like a wooden cart bound for a cousin's barn. Now, don't get me wrong. Love happened. It snuck through the cracks, like warm bread cooling on a windowsill. There are stories, preserved in letters and whispers, of true affection between spouses. There are even accounts of women running away with unsuitable partners, trading casks of ale and family status for stolen kisses and escape on a borrowed donkey. Very cinematic. But for most girls, their parents skipped the talk. Why? Because the talk wasn't about birds and bees. It was about contracts and cloistering. Once married, a daughter legally belonged to her husband, and before that, she belonged to Dad. This is why she couldn't just run off or reject a suitor without risking social disgrace. Marriage shaped inheritances, borders, alliances, even the local cheese economy, if you trace the cow dowries far enough. Meanwhile, the church was also involved, as it is with most things involving guilt and paperwork. Around the 12th century, the Catholic Church began to insist that marriage was a holy sacrament, something sacred between 2 people and God. But people still treated it like a neighborhood merger, a very solemn one, involving candles and perhaps a suspiciously underage cousin. Note that the vast majority of girls had absolutely no clue what happened after marriage. The wedding night? Shrouded in mystery. Literally, sometimes. Beds were strange places, draped with curtains and sometimes blessed by priests. There are records of noble couples being watched by witnesses to confirm the marriage was legally sealed, if you will. Quietly horrifying. To prepare a daughter for such an event, what could a mother say? Listen, my sweet. You will one day lie beside a man who owns 3 goats and a strong chin. You'll bear him children, manage the turnips, and carry on with your embroidery, unless you too are called to die of something vaguely blamed on swamp air. Not quite the cozy fireside chat you might imagine. So, the silence persisted. Girls were taught how to spin wool, stretch dough, and remain modest, while the mechanics and expectations of marriage remained a foggy, whispered abyss. The less said, the kinder it felt. And honestly, some mothers simply didn't know what to say. After all, their own weddings had been arranged, celebrated, and survived without much instruction. If it had worked for them, wobbly and wordless as it was, surely it had worked for the next generation. And so we drift into the next page of time, where porridge boils gently in the background and the candlelight flickers just so. If these stories helps you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. In the delicate hush of a candlelit drawing room, somewhere in 17th century England, a young lady named Arabella sat demurely upon a velvet settee, embroidering daisies onto something that may have once been a handkerchief and was gradually becoming a vaguely floral rectangle of confusion. Her mother, Lady Emmeline of rather large manner, sat stiffly beside her, sipping a tea so fragile it practically apologized for existing. Arabella, who was on her third week of being of marital age, had questions. Not many, just a few, such as, what precisely happens after the I do part? Is it anything to do with the recent mystery of Lady Pembroke's sudden expression of smug exhaustion? And why does Nurse Millicent keep referring to her father's snoring as a blessing in disguise? Your average 17th century parent, however, would rather plunge into a nettle-filled duck pond than explain the concept of marriage to their own children. Daughters in particular were expected to acquire their knowledge on the topic from a series of raised eyebrows, cryptic warnings, the Book of Common Prayer, and, if they were very lucky, a scandalous whisper during embroidery lessons. If you're wondering why this delicate silence was so prevalent, the answer lies in equal parts embarrassment, religion, rampant superstition, and some very old wives' tales that had never been introduced to people with an ounce of biological awareness. You see, talking about marriage meant eventually talking about what happens in a marriage bed, and once that door creaked open, there were about 40 unwritten chapters of social panic that followed. Entire generations were raised entirely on euphemisms. Eager young newlyweds, stepping into their bridal chambers, would often have only the vaguest understanding of what was expected. Some thought it involved prayer. Some thought it involved dancing. One poor, bewildered duchess is on record as having assumed it had something to do with gardening. The church, of course, didn't help. The official position on marital relations was as follows. It was best not to think about it, speak about it, or enjoy it. Ideally, it occurred in silence, in the dark, and was followed by both parties repenting profusely. Theologically, pleasure was something Catholics confessed, Calvinists feared, and Puritans treated like smallpox. And yet, these same societies desperately wanted their daughters to get married, preferably by 18, preferably to someone with a title and sweaty landholdings. But knowledge? No. That would ruin the delicate ignorance that was apparently key to feminine virtue. You were to be chaste, quiet, and just bewildered enough to stay obedient. It worked about as well as you'd imagine. Certainly, there were books, though calling them instructional is being generous. Genteel ladies might be offered a copy of The Whole Duty of a Woman, a thrilling title if ever there was one. Inside, they would find lines such as, "A virtuous woman is a crown to her husband," which may sound flattering, until you realize most crowns in that century were heavy, uncomfortable, and rarely worn without political consequence. Worse, the preferred method for educating daughters was to not. Instead, a mother might sigh deeply, avert her eyes, and gently hand her a Bible. Occasionally, she'd mutter something about the wifely arts, which could mean anything from pastry making to surviving childbirth in a nightgown. This strategy of strategic ignorance was upheld across classes. Farmers' daughters had fewer embroidery hoops and more chances of witnessing barnyard behavior, but still the finer mechanics of marriage were wrapped in euphemism and sealed with vague advice. "You'll know when it happens," one mother told her daughter, ominously. as though speaking of ghosts. Of course, some girls figured it out. Some even enjoyed themselves, though they rarely admitted it out loud, lest they be labelled forward or, heaven forbid, French. Meanwhile, Arabella of rather large manner finished her embroidery, which now looked remarkably like a startled hedgehog, and risked asking her mother in the softest possible tone, "Mamma, what exactly happens after the wedding breakfast?" Lady Emmeline paled, stood, and promptly changed the subject to rhubarb. Which brings us gently to the next peculiar manner in which society avoided answering the simplest questions of life, the role of education, and how it conveniently stopped right before things got interesting. If you were a young woman in the year 1472, your understanding of marriage could probably fit comfortably on the back of a spoon. Not even a particularly large spoon, more like the decorative kind your grandmother keeps in a drawer labelled "for guests only." The reasons for this informational blackout were as layered as a medieval onion tart, though somewhat less delicious. It wasn't just that people avoided discussing the birds and the bees, it was that they'd rather have been flung into the moat than explain what happened after the wedding feast. Not to worry though. Most wedding nights in the Middle Ages were so awkward, they might as well have been choreographed by a team of monks who had only read about affection in Latin. Let's begin in a candlelit chamber, somewhere in rural France, or perhaps the lowlands of England, regions where sheep outnumbered humans and gossip was a viable currency. A young bride sits silently on the edge of a feather-stuffed mattress, the air thick with lavender and the perfume of absolute confusion. Her new husband, who has spent more time with his horse than with people, stands awkwardly by the fireplace, pretending to inspect a tapestry. Neither of them knows what to do, and neither wishes to admit it. Mom never explained. Nor did Aunt Gertrude, who once said cryptically, "You'll understand after the linen's been washed," as if that were helpful. And this is how it often was. Marriage as a concept, an institution, and a contractual exchange of goats was considered more dignified when shrouded in mystery. The less a daughter knew, it was thought, the better off her reputation. This created its own unique brand of chaos, particularly during the Renaissance, when sleeves were puffy, but information was not. Parents, especially mothers of a certain rank, lived in perpetual fear that their daughters would ask questions. What exactly does a husband expect? Was the sort of inquiry that could send a duchess sprinting toward the garden maze, never to return. The assumption was that knowledge would tarnish innocence, and if purity was a maiden's most valuable asset, realism became the enemy. Better she trip over her wedding night like a blindfolded fawn than know too much and risk being considered enthusiastic. Now there were, of course, whispered exceptions. Occasionally, a well-meaning servant or an eccentric aunt might slip a girl a parchment titled something like "Advice for the Curious Bride," filled with vague euphemisms involving flowers and bees and the mysterious unlocking of the garden gate. It was not uncommon for such advice to prompt more panic than preparation. Curiously, fathers were even less involved in these conversations. A father's role was largely to choose the husband, assure himself that the dowry had been respected, and then disappear conveniently around the time the wedding candles were being snuffed out. If asked for guidance, he'd likely combust into a string of coughing fits, mumble something about honor, and vanish into the stables. This general silence wasn't due to laziness, it was a performance of societal virtue. To speak frankly about love, bodies, or expectations was to court sin, scandal, or worse, Italian poetry. And we cannot overstate the anxiety that Italian poetry inflicted on the respectable households of Europe. All those sonnets, all that passion, it was the sort of thing that made mothers clutch their pearls and call for the herbal tea. In many places, even church officials encouraged reticence. A priest might deliver a sermon on sacred matrimony, but with all the specificity of a foggy window pane. If questioned further, the advice might be, pray together first, and the rest will come naturally, which is solid spiritual guidance. but less so if you're wondering why your husband is attempting to disrobe like he's attended exactly 0 rehearsals. Despite all this, marriages somehow carried on. Children were born, heirs produced, though not always promptly, as evidenced by the flurry of fertility charms and petitionary candles lit in majestic chapels. And eventually, young brides learned the truth, not through parental lectures or helpful pamphlets, but through experience, conversation, and, more often than not, sheer bewildered accident. Still, the tradition of withholding the good stuff endured for centuries, because nothing says timeless institution quite like sending someone into a lifelong partnership with instructions that amount to, "You'll figure it out eventually, dear." And so, our tale carries on, not with answers, but with more questions. Questions like, what happened when these clueless young couples found themselves actually married? Well, if you're comfortable and your pillow is fluffed just so, we're about to find out. In a quiet English village during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, a monarch famous for her refusal of marriage and surprisingly good wigs, life was a patchwork quilt of tradition, superstition, and the occasional barn fire. It was a time when people believed that bathing more than once a season could summon disease, and where the concept of romance was largely reserved for troubadours and sheep. The Tudor household was a curious environment when it came to daughters and marriage. Imagine a place where girls were expected to embroider samplers, memorize household accounts, and practice their curtsy technique, all while remaining blissfully unaware of what marriage, capital M-E, marriage, entirely entailed. Mothers, often the keepers of domestic mysteries, could churn butter with eloquence and scold a misbehaving rooster with gravitas, but became curiously tight-lipped when the subject of matrimony hovered too near the dinner table. This reticence wasn't entirely a matter of awkwardness. In fact, there was a certain social blueprint at play. Young women were expected to be obedient, modest, and, ideally, confused. A mystified daughter was easier to manage, easier to marry off, easier to keep from eloping with the local lute player who only had one good tooth and a tragic fondness for mead. Many daughters were told that marriage was about duty, alliances, and producing children shaped vaguely like their father, but with more manageable opinions. Love, if it came up at all, was described the way one might describe weather, something that occasionally happened but rarely with predictability, and never when you needed it most. It didn't help that marriage in Tudor times was more of a property exchange than a ceremony of affection. Once a woman married, everything she owned, including her sense of self, legally passed to her husband. Dowries were negotiated by fathers in tones more accustomed to livestock trading. Daughters, shimmering in silk and submission, were rarely brought into these discussions. Their role was to wait, be patient, and not ask too many questions regarding the finer details of connubial union. When questions did arise, genuine human questions like, what happens after the vows? Or, why do I need to marry someone whose eyebrows look like unfriendly caterpillars? Answers were deflected with the practiced agility of a court jester evading a thrown turnip. "Oh, you'll understand when you're older," mothers would say, despite their daughter being precisely the age of betrothal. "It's all very natural," they'd add somewhat hysterically, before running off to polish the same pewter spoon they'd been polishing for 4 days straight. Even education provided no safe haven. Girls were taught to read the Bible, sure, but only select chapters, the sort where women were either virtuous or turned into salt. Any earthly knowledge about human relationships had to be pieced together from witnessing farm animals interact. This, as you might imagine, left much to be explained and very little explained well. The local clergy didn't help matters. A marriage sermon was less a lesson in partnership and more a stern warning to be fruitful and multiply, implicitly, without asking too many questions. The Church of England, fresh off its awkward divorce from Rome, was deeply interested in your soul, but notably squeamish about your bedroom. And so, in homes with thatched roofs, and overcooked stews. Daughters entered marriage like someone boarding a ship to somewhere they couldn't locate on any map. They had gifts they'd never unwrapped, letters they couldn't read, and a husband who might be thrice their age and smell faintly of pickled eel. Still, the absence of information somehow became its own kind of tradition, a tangled ritual passed down like an heirloom. The mother who says too little, the daughter who wanders too late, and the silence braided neatly into her wedding bonnet. But what happened once that wedding bonnet was unwound? What did married life actually resemble from inside the bustle and behind the locked bedroom door? Let's allow ourselves to drift gently there, into the flickering, candlelit chambers of a wedded Tudor household, where the real education would begin, with or without anyone's helpful explanation. Long before the talk became an awkward parental rite of passage, somewhere between buying your first bra and pretending not to notice Romeo and Juliet is mostly about hormones, the subject of marriage was handled with something closer to strategic silence. If you were a young girl in medieval Europe, you likely knew as much about love as a turnip knows about algebra. Marriage, you see, was not a thing to be understood, but rather one to be endured, or, in more optimistic cases, tolerated with dignity and a well-embroidered handkerchief. Imagine a small, drafty manor house with a view of sheep, eternally nibbling under grey skies. You, a nobleman's daughter of roughly 12 3/4 years, are brushing your hair with a comb made of bone, wondering what sort of ointment cures boredom. Suddenly, your father announces that you've been promised to a man who can read Latin and owns exactly 6 pigs. One of them, gasp, spotted, an obvious sign of wealth. Now, you might have blinked and asked, "But father, what does marriage mean?" At which point he'd clear his throat, look as though he'd swallowed a hedgehog whole, and mutter something about duty, dynasties, and leaving your questions in the hands of the village priest. History was full of people who considered honesty, especially about romantic matters, to be deeply impolite and potentially fatal to manners. Girls were to prepare for marriage with needlework, etiquette lessons, and the pleasant sense that something important, and perhaps vaguely frightening, was on the horizon, like a thunderstorm wearing a lace veil. This wasn't merely a fluke of prudishness. In many cases, parents were genuinely not equipped to explain marriage as an emotional journey. For them, it was a contract, a well-negotiated union of land, livestock, and last names. Love, passion, and compatibility were ideas to be repressed until they developed ulcers or expressed subtly through flower arrangements and pregnant pauses at dinner. There was a time, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, when the list of a daughter's virtues included her silence, her needlepoint, and her bewilderingly small appetite. Her understanding of marital expectations was not considered necessary, just so long as she could curtsy at the right angle and never ask where babies came from. Curiosity, after all, was a slippery slope leading straight to individuality. It wasn't just noble families. Even among peasants, and I say this with affection, the subject of affection remained unspoken. A practical woman in a thatched roof cottage might mutter something like, "A husband must bring 3 sacks of grain and not snore too loud." Beyond that, intimacy was a mystery best left to wedding night revelations and whispered gossip in the fields. In Tudor England, the preferred method of marital education was exposure to heavily censored biblical passages and the occasional morality play in which someone regrettably kissed before marriage and was promptly struck by lightning or transformed into a goose, perhaps both. The lesson was unmistakable. Don't ask questions, and under no circumstances should you enjoy anything. Of course, not every parent was quite so tight-lipped. Some mothers, those rare, daring souls, offered advice with the same delicacy one might use while juggling hedgehogs. Hushed words, euphemisms, phrases like, A wife must be gentle and agreeable when the shadow of the moon hangs low. Translation: you're going to find this all very confusing, and you'll be expected to smile through it. Men fared no better. Young boys were often sent to observe adult behavior as apprentices, squires, or spare furniture movers. Their marital education consisted of learning Latin sayings and how not to spill wine at important banquets. The birds and the bees remained deeply uninterested in human affairs. And so generation after generation waltzed into marriage with very little idea of what it entailed, and even less preparedness for the emotional acrobatics it would require. They learned, some eventually loved, and others quietly resented everything but the goats. But don't worry, while social norms stifled open conversations, the human heart found ways. Through stolen glances, poetry, excessive embroidery, and love songs that were almost definitely not about sheep. Now, as the moon climbs further and the sleepy world twirls gently beneath your dreams, we begin to drift toward a place where courtship makes its grand entrance, bearing roses, riddles, and an alarming fondness for walking outdoors in damp weather, somewhere in the candlelit hush of 16th century England, where chamber pots were just as common as chamber music and nobody smelled the way you hoped they would. Girls of a certain age began noticing that the adults around them grew increasingly uncomfortable during conversations involving babies, kisses, or anything remotely shaped like a pear. Fathers coughed violently whenever the subject of weddings came up. Mothers changed topics so fast it could induce social whiplash. And no one, absolutely no one, explained why young ladies were required to carry embroidery hoops and faint modestly when the butcher tipped his hat. You see, back then, marriage was the ultimate adult secret, one so dangerous and mysterious that parents felt it was better left unexplained. Like why cheese sometimes sweats, or why Uncle Geoffrey only visits after 3 meads. Imagine you're a young woman in Tudor England. You've just turned 14, which, in those days, was not only the age of potential marriage, but also the age at which people expected you to start acting like someone's full-time wife, and maybe part-time goat milker. You were handed a prayer book, a rosary, and the unsettling advice to mind your reputation, which sounded deep, but explained absolutely nothing. The trouble was, marriage wasn't so much something one looked forward to, as it was a full-blown economic arrangement dressed up in a lace bonnet. For the lower classes, it meant extra hands in the field and maybe a better shed. For the upper crust, those with names like Lady Petunia, Featherdrip of Wendingtonshire, marriage was about family alliances, land, and perpetuating the noble tradition of marrying one's distant cousin, because that's just what one did. But nowhere in this dutiful little contract was anyone writing handy definitions of what, precisely, wifely duties entailed. Instead, daughters were kept in the dark with the sort of precision usually reserved for cheese caves or secret royal illegitimate children. The few hints they received were often cryptic and more intimidating than instructive. Phrases like, "Your husband will explain," or "Just lie still and think of England," sent a generation of young women into matrimony armed with little more than vague notions, breath mints, and spiritual panic. Now, to be fair, it wasn't just ignorance and malicious secrecy. It was also theology, etiquette, and a good deal of Victorian-style denial, a few centuries early. In Christian Europe, open discussions of marital intimacy was something best, left between confessional boxes and exceptionally awkward illustrated manuscripts. The Church, powerful as ever and a firm believer in mysteries of all kinds, upheld that anything related to physical connection was strictly for procreation and should be approached with the moral enthusiasm of dishwashing. Certainly not the kind of thing you discussed at the dinner table, especially if parsnips were being served. In some households, usually the ones with lace doilies and enough candlesticks for minor theatrical productions, mothers might pass down cryptic guidance. This came most often in the form of a small, fluttery book with a title like the proper governance of a lady's household and souls within, or worse, an embroidered sampler bearing the words "duty before desire," which would presumably hang above the marriage bed in a bold act of romantic sabotage. Among rural communities, wisdom was passed along in even stranger ways, through folk tales and herbal metaphors. Someone's great aunt might pull a girl aside and ominously discuss turnips, cucumbers, or the sacred duties of the garden without ever once explaining what an actual wedding night might involve. It wasn't that they didn't care, mind you. Many mothers wanted to protect their daughters from the messier aspects of life by not mentioning them at all. Of course, this turned marriage into an elaborate game of emotional charades. Brides walked down the aisle with smiles frozen somewhere between terror and vague hope, only to find themselves wind-whipped into a very different storm once the ceremony was over and the guests were drunkenly misplacing their hats. Many young women were left to cobble together their knowledge through whispers, eyebrow waggles, and the occasional traumatic barnyard observation. Understandably, emotional whiplash was a standard feature of becoming a wife. One day, you're sewing monograms onto linen napkins shaped like birds, and the next, you're wondering why your new husband looks so triumphantly practical about removing his boots. Sleepy listener, as we settle deeper into the soft twilight of history's more avoidant parenting techniques, the silence around marriage traditions grows louder, as if centuries of mothers are all quietly whispering, "She'll figure it out." But we will not judge. We will simply drift, gently, slowly, toward the forgotten expectations embroidered behind velvet curtains and candlelit rooms, where a dowry wasn't just money. It was a persuasive essay written in coin. Somewhere ahead, the question of dowries and who carried what across the altar waits, stitched in gold thread and polite economic pressure. In the drowsy flicker of candlelight, beneath the creaking beams of a manor house gently sinking into the 17th century, a girl might ask her mother about embroidery, or possibly poultry, but not about marriage. Certainly not. That topic lived behind a polite cough and an abrupt change of subject, or, in dire cases, the arrival of a tray of boiled pears. You see, dear listener, in many parts of early modern Europe, the art of not explaining things had evolved into something of a cultural sport. And at the very top of the medal stand, conversations about marriage, or more precisely, the extraordinary efforts parents made to never have any. Now this wasn't because they were cruel, or shy, or even particularly Victorian. The term Victorian, after all, wouldn't arrive till Queen Victoria herself dramatically entered stage left, trailing 8 petticoats and a rigid sense of propriety. No, long before that, families learned to treat the subject of matrimony like a family heirloom wallpapered into a closet. Obviously there, but best left untouched. The trouble, of course, was that marriage in these centuries wasn't viewed so much as a personal journey of love and macaroni-jointed swans, but more like a small-scale diplomatic treaty with livestock. It was a transaction negotiated in parlors and sometimes by letter, where love, if mentioned at all, was considered a luxury item, something like pineapple, or not dying before age 40. And within those negotiations, daughters were expected to behave with the quiet poise of a glass doily. They were to be virtuous, silent, and fully unaware that the man standing awkwardly near the punch bowl might soon be their husband, and possibly their cousin. It was considered of utmost importance that a girl remain unspoiled, not just in the biblical sense, but also unencumbered by information. Parents feared that if daughters knew anything too early, say, at the reckless age of 15, they might run off with the wrong sort of man, perhaps one who played the lute, or worse, had opinions. So, to protect the dignity and utility of their soon-to-be bartered offspring, parents relied on a secret weapon, millennia of euphemisms. Marriage was described using such pastoral charm that it's a wonder children survived the confusion. They were told of taking up house, or joining hands at the altar, or simply settling, a phrase which may still haunt modern dating apps. The wedding night, meanwhile, was never mentioned directly, but implied with either a knowing look or a sudden need to reorganize the sock drawer. Occasionally, an elderly aunt might appear, always an aunt, and mutter something vague about a duty to the household. More than one girl assumed this meant learning to stuff partridges, and this classic confusion spiraled all the way through the great drawing rooms and dull parlors of history. Consider Anne of Austria, Queen Consort to Louis XIII of France. She was married off at 14, barely fluent in French or human biology. It's said she spent the early months of marriage more preoccupied with jigsaw puzzles than the political alliance between Spain and France she now embodied. Even among the middle classes, where marriage was slowly gaining traction, the actual logistics remained cloaked in a delightful fog. Advice manuals of the 18th century would solemnly advise a bride to hold her modesty dear and cling to the sacred mysteries of her station. They rarely mentioned that she might be sharing a bed with someone who thought socks were optional in January. Of course, not all parents were quite so elusive. There were outliers, progressive thinkers, poets, maybe someone's drunken uncle who had too much mead at Michaelmas and blurted everything out during a hymn. But for the most part, the great parental silence endured. And so daughters arrived at the threshold of marriage like sailors aboard fog-laced ships, uncertain of the land ahead, trusting only the timbers of duty, family legacy, and lace-trimmed moral instruction. It was easier, perhaps, for everyone to believe that marriage was simply the next beautiful chapter in a tale with no unpleasant footnotes, which is rather how we got here. Centuries of stiff hemming, soft coughing, and the exquisite, baffling art of parental omission. But as we lean further into this tale, drifting among the quiet corridors of historical matrimony, we'll soon discover what happened when the veil of secrecy was reluctantly lifted. Softly now, the candle dims. Let us wander toward that moment together. By the early 1700s, society had firmly established a reputation for being both extremely interested in decorum and completely allergic to directness, especially when marriage was concerned. Nowhere was this more apparent than in what was cheerfully known as a proper upbringing, which usually meant a girl could recite Latin mottos but had never seen a chicken lay an egg, because that would simply raise too many questions. In genteel households throughout Europe, young women were taught embroidery, pianoforte, and the delicate art of pretending not to notice when someone said something wildly suggestive at dinner. This skill, known in certain households as strategic obliviousness, was highly prized, right alongside being able to faint at the right moment when offered a marriage proposal from a cousin named Reginald. Let us now drift into a drawing room in Bath. It is slightly draughty, smells faintly of lavender, and contains Miss Lavinia Hartwell, aged 17 3/4, who is being educated in the noble, if somewhat bewildering art of becoming a wife, without ever learning what that actually meant. Her mother, Lady Hartwell, was a woman of impeccable lineage and infallible repression. "You must be prepared, my dear," Lady Hartwell told Lavinia, pouring tea as if pouring secrets straight into silence. "One day, your husband will wish to walk with you in the evenings, and you must bear it with grace." Lavinia blinked. She wondered if this walk would involve a compass, a horse, or possibly a lantern. No follow-up questions were allowed. Now, this curious refusal to discuss the most basic aspects of married life wasn't just Victorian pearl-clutching. It had roots sewn deep into the entrails of medieval and early modern family structures. For much of European history, particularly among the upper classes, marriage was not an affair of the heart, but a merger of assets, and hearts, like contraband, were better kept out of official records. Daughters were transactions in petticoats, gently nudged down the aisle by parents eager to secure a vineyard or an ancestral pig farm. Discussing the marital duties that lay beyond the wedding feast was as tasteless as asking how the sausages at said feast were made. Everyone knew something happened, but no one agreed on how to describe it. Instead, euphemisms abounded. One might be told that the bride becomes the helpmeet in the man's house, or that her duties now turn inward, toward the hearth. This, naturally, could mean anything from lighting fires to bearing 10 children while wearing a corset made of despair. It depended heavily on which aunt you asked. Some religions and moral guides did attempt to explain a little more, some unintentionally with alarming vividness. Church manuals from the 16th century sometimes referred to marriage as a spiritual and bodily union sanctioned by God, which sounded holy enough, until you realized that bodily was doing quite a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. In more scholarly homes, a young woman might accidentally stumble across medical diagrams in her father's library, often drawn with such unconvincing anatomy that the female reproductive system resembled either a tulip or a swan preparing for battle. And yet, silence persisted. Why? Well, fear was part of it. Parents worried that if a girl knew too much, she might develop dangerous ideas. Dangerous ideas, in this context, included autonomy, desire, and not marrying the first glum baronet who looked in her general direction. There was also the small matter of sheer embarrassment. Many mothers had never been told anything themselves. So when it came time to explain the matter to their daughters, they passed down not knowledge, but a family heirloom of whispered awkwardness, like slightly anxious runners in a relay race of avoidance. This grand silence was perhaps most clearly expressed in one particularly bizarre educational book from 1788, titled The Young Lady's Friend, which offered endless advice on deportment, moral virtue, and how not to overexpress an opinion about politics or bread. However, when it came to the actual function of marriage, the author simply paused, took a large metaphoric breath, and wrote, "A lady will discover such truths as necessary, in time, under proper tutelage." One could almost see the author backing out of the room, nervously knocking over a candelabra. And so it was that an entire generation of young women entered wedlock educated in everything but the one thing marriage actually entailed. Lavinia Hartwell, for instance, remained wholly preoccupied with whether she should learn to ride side-saddle, unaware that her future husband, the slightly clammy Lord Wetherby, was mostly interested in producing male heirs and not, as she'd hoped, painting watercolor landscapes at sunrise. Still, the embroidery was lovely. Now, with minds gently drifting over corseted mysteries and long-forgotten manuals of decorum, let us quietly tiptoe toward a more curious institution still: the bridal night and the many peculiar rituals it involved. It is a bizarre but well-documented truth that for much of history, daughters were expected to walk blindly into marriage like lambs attending a mysterious social ceremony involving lace, livestock, and a man they'd spoken to once at a harvest dance. This wasn't necessarily out of malicious intent. It was more like a communal, generational shrug in corset form. Parents, especially mothers, avoided the particulars of matrimony with an artfulness that would have baffled modern theatre critics. They didn't just change the subject, they changed the weather, the moral temperature, and even, it seems, time itself. Take, for instance, the delicate etiquette manuals of Georgian England, which offered young women advice so vague and decorous it could have applied equally to dinner parties or demonic possessions. One wildly popular guide, The Mirror of Graces, waxed rhapsodic about the virtue of modesty, the perils of rouge, and why a lady should never, ever laugh too hard. It whispered about marriage the way you might whisper about an elderly cat who once attacked a family member. But where did this tender avoidance come from? To understand it, we must slip our woolen slippers on and teeter softly into a parlour somewhere in Restoration England, circa 1675, where tea was hot, wigs were hot, and topics of conversation were not. Here, mothers passed down generations of wisdom in low voices that stopped just before, explaining what actually happened after the wedding linens had been washed and a new cradle appeared in the hallway. Sure, young women were warned about the dangers of giddiness and forward glances, but they were rarely told what they were supposed to do once the fiddlers stopped playing and their new husbands politely asked if they might have a word in private. For many fathers, the idea of explaining marriage was as awkward as being caught in one's nightshirt by the household staff. Not mortifying enough to ruin you completely, but close. Even in ancient Rome, where people were generally more blunt about bodily functions and theatre tickets, the virtues of chastity were upheld with the same fervour one might apply to preserving good wine. Brides often arrived at their marriages with more understanding of how to fold a toga than how to navigate a wedding night. Virginal innocence was considered a sign of noble breeding, as though ignorance itself might be traced back to Julius Caesar. And yet, fascinatingly, this persistent silence had rituals all its own. Teen brides were often guided not by their parents but by older, married women, neighbors, aunts, or in more luxurious households, seasoned servants who would whisper vague metaphors involving fruit, flowers, or doors that must now be entered. These cryptic, horticultural riddles hardly inspired confidence. One can only imagine a trembling 16-year-old fumbling through the language of orchids and beehives, gooseberries and garden gates, desperately trying to determine whether she was meant to wait, run, or offer refreshments. Royal courts weren't much better. Take poor Marie Antoinette, who was a teenager from Austria shoved into the gloved hands of French royalty, newly married and thoroughly unbriefed. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, did send advice, but it read more like a bureaucratic pep talk than maternal guidance. Be amiable, do not scowl, try not to make France mad. At no point did anyone mention what exactly she was supposed to do when the Dauphin took a fancy to her and decided it would be a good time for dynasty making. Unsurprisingly, nothing much happened for years, leading to diplomatic panic, rumors, and at least a couple of strongly worded letters between European courts. Why, you might wonder, was silence the preferred method? Well, society operated on a teetering tower of give-no-details delicacy. Reputation was everything, and good girls were supposed to shimmer with virtue and mystifying restraint. To admit knowledge of the marital bed was to suggest experience, and experience implied scandal, even if the only thing a girl had done was read a medical pamphlet about goats. Besides, the entire construct of marriage was often less about love or companionship, and more about property exchange, dowries, and the noble tradition of producing an heir and a spare. Romantic affection was desirable, sure, but not required. A fond breakfast conversation could be enough to consider the union successful. Anything more was icing on a rather unsweetened loaf of barley bread. It wasn't all gloom and confusion, of course. Some mothers did try to explain, usually with a brave cup of tea in hand, a well-rehearsed sigh, and euphemisms involving the moon. Fathers, on the other hand, preferred to avoid eye contact altogether and focus on arranging the dowry as though it was a high-stakes game of livestock Tetris. A cow here, a plot of land there, a sort of matrimonial Sudoku of breeding potential. So daughters tiptoed forward, clueless and corseted, into futures constructed more from guesswork than guidance. And society, bless its tightly buttoned waistcoat, considered this perfectly normal. A rite of passage best navigated with pure thoughts, vague metaphors, and the occasional fruit comparison. As the candlelight flickers lower, let's stay comfortably nestled among the hush of powdered wigs and whispered, or the warnings, for something curious is drifting just beyond the lace curtain. The wedding night itself. And what, exactly, young brides were expected to do once the guests had gone home. Picture, if you will, the rustle of silk skirts brushing against a stone floor, the muted clinking of porcelain teacups, and the inexplicably tense silence of a drawing room where everyone knows something, but no one is allowed to say it. The setting is a prim Georgian parlour, somewhere between Jane Austen's imagination and the reality of a rural English manor, circa 1794. The fire crackles, the embroidery is unreasonably complex, and a daughter, named Arabella, of course, sits straight-backed with perfect posture, expertly managing to both sip tea and burn with confusion. Arabella had just turned 18, the age by which, apparently, a young lady was expected to have mastered the art of walking upstairs gracefully, writing poetry with tragic amounts of sighing, and expressing deep romantic yearning while doing needlepoint. But no one, not once, even hinted at what actually happened after marriage. One day, her mother had pulled her aside with the kind of seriousness typically reserved for royal assassinations or overcooked pheasant. With robes rustling like dry leaves and brows knitted into the shape of ancestral shame, Lady Wintringham declared, "You shall soon be a wife." When Arabella dared to ask what, precisely, one did as a wife, the air grew noticeably colder. "Your duties shall become known to you, in time." Which, of course, is the historical equivalent of replying to a child's question about taxes with, "You'll understand when you're older." Only this was about lifelong companionship, shared finances, family lineage, and, oh dear, the birds and bees. And yet, for centuries, girls like Arabella were expected to walk blindly into the most socially defining contracts of their lives armed with a set of napkin rings, an embroidered Bible, and absolutely zero context for what was to follow the "I do." This ancient and well-preserved silence belonged to a long-standing cultural strategy known as deliberate vagueness. You see, in societies where innocence was prized like emeralds and anything natural was considered alarming, the idea of explaining marriage, especially its physical components, was met with the kind of horror typically reserved for French cheese and bare ankles. Parents told daughters everything around marriage, as in how to throw a dinner party, how to faint gracefully at news of scandal, how to embroider terrifyingly lifelike depictions of lilies. But when it came to what actually happened in marriage, especially in those dimly lit, candlelit hours after the final guest had left the wedding ball, we received little more than a firm pat and a confusing wink. Etiquette guides from the 18th and 19th centuries were masterpieces of omission. Take, for instance, The Young Lady's Companion, published in 1720, which provided pages upon pages about how to cure bacon, clean silver, and pray properly during a thunderstorm, absolutely none of which prepared a young woman for discovering whether her husband snored, danced shirtless when drunk, or had never once washed his feet. Of course, one might hope the clergy would clarify things. But alas, sermons were confusingly metaphorical. Marriage, a particularly poetic vicar might proclaim, is like a garden. There must be tilling before one may expect blossoms. This led to widespread horticultural anxiety. In truth, this tradition of deliberate naivety had its roots in older ideas about social status and purity. A noble-born young woman was considered marriage-worthy precisely because she knew nothing. Her ignorance was marketed like marble skin and harp playing. The unspoken logic was, if a girl did know something, that meant she'd been learning. And goodness, where would she have picked up that knowledge? It did not help that public education, especially regarding things like anatomy, relationships, and what to do when your husband proudly displays a family heirloom shaped like a trout, was virtually non-existent. For many girls, the first lesson came on the first night, and hardly ever with footnotes. This led to what historians, not me, but far more formal people in Tweed, have called first night trauma, where the shock of marital life produced results ranging from existential confusion to fainting spells, depending on the era's prevailing corset technology. Still, knowledge did circulate, quietly under the table between cousins, and in books so scandalous they had to be hidden behind fake cookery titles like Recipes for a Good Woman. But on the whole, the strategy endured. Ambiguity protected innocence, or at least preserved the illusion of it. So Arabella, like countless fictional and unfortunately very real girls before her, tiptoed into womanhood with the same trepidation as stepping into a foreign opera, unsure when to clap, what language was being spoken, or why all the men were wearing tights. But the silence, oh the silence, was never total, because sooner or later, someone would talk. Usually an aunt. Usually after 2 glasses of something suspiciously named medicinal sherry. And when that happened, well, that's a story best whispered during the next quiet hour. Imagine a dinner party in 16th century Florence. Candles sputter on long wooden tables. Bread gets torn apart with unapologetic gusto. And somewhere in the background, a lute player quietly regrets his career choices. The air is thick with rosemary, gossip, and phrases like dowry negotiations, which is just Renaissance for "I love your daughter's personality, but let's talk assets." It's at this sort of gathering where marriage got discussed, but not explained. At least, not to the bride. You see, young women in Europe during this time were expected to approach marriage the same way we approach assembling IKEA furniture, with zero instructions, vague drawings, and an overwhelming feeling that someone should have warned us about the tiny wrench. And the mystery was very much by design. Parents, particularly mothers, would often speak of marriage in devoutly poetic riddles. "It is a woman's destiny," they'd sigh, while stitching something called a hope chest, which contained anything from embroidery samplers to whisper-thin nightgowns no one dared to ask about. Daughters learned that marriage involved veils, ceremonies, and moving into a house with someone you barely knew. And beyond that, a dramatic fade to black. Why the secrecy, you ask? Well, a cocktail of religious modesty, social control, and a sprinkling of sheer denial. The church, whose influence on matchmaking was less wingman and more chaperone holding a Bible, upheld the idea that discussing bodily matters, even in the vaguest terms, was akin to handing out tickets to sin. Virginity wasn't just a private virtue, it was a currency, stapled to a woman's worth like a receipt to a pair of extremely uncomfortable shoes. To explain what would actually happen after I do was to risk encouraging behavior that might happen before I do, and heaven help us all if that occurred. Of course, not everyone followed this unwritten no-tell policy. Midwives, for example, often played the rogue aunties of society. If mothers refused to explain the logistics of marriage, there was always a midwife or a particularly worldly servant girl ready to offer side comments while peeling carrots, saying things like, "Let's just say, milk won't be the only thing curdling on your wedding night." Cryptic? Yes. Alarming? Also yes. Helpful? In its own way. Still, most daughters entered marriage with all the clarity of a foggy mirror. A noble girl from France in the early 1500s might know how to embroider lilies onto cuff sleeves or address a letter formally to a bishop's second cousin. But when it came to physical intimacy, or the complex economics of managing a household, she was genuinely bewildered. One particularly renowned etiquette manual of the time, written by a monk with way too much free time, advised new brides to always smile modestly in bed and say nothing. If that's not a blueprint for confusion, I don't know what is. Even more curious was how many parents treated marriage less like a milestone and more like the final round of bartering at a meat market. Fathers negotiated dowries with enough intensity to qualify for modern reality television. One Venetian merchant famously refused to marry off his daughter until her suitor provided 2 goats, 3 bolts of Florentine silk, and a thick German Bible. Love, clearly, was optional. Upholstery was not. Some parents tried to bridge the gap with metaphors. A favorite involved flowers, blooming under the moonlight, which sounds mysterious and lovely until you remember that no one explained what was blooming or why. Another classic involved bees and honey, despite most girls having never seen a beehive, let alone understood why a sting might be symbolic. You might be tempted to pity them, these young brides, sent off in satin and silence. But here's the strange twist. Many of them became remarkably adaptable. Some learned quickly, thanks to whispered gossip or trial and error. Others wielded their confusion like armor, sidestepping awkward situations with the elegance of a swan gliding past a puddle. And occasionally, perhaps at a dusk-lit dinner long into their marriages, these women would lean in toward their own daughters and impart the same cryptic half-knowledge, thus continuing a tradition of eloquent evasion passed on like heirloom hairbrushes. Beautiful, slightly dangerous, and never fully explained. As the candles flicker low in our imagined, banquet hall. We leave the curious daughters of history behind for now. Gowns rustling, minds racing, dreams full of bees and blooming things. But elsewhere, what came next in marriage required more than confusion. It demanded instruction, sometimes protest, and often a great deal of quiet rebellion. It was a curious thing indeed, the way 18th century mothers could discuss the virtues of embroidery thread in hushed cathartic detail, but would rather fake a sudden fainting spell than explain how their daughters might one day find themselves legally, morally, and mysteriously yoked to a man in a powdered wig. You see, marriage, that cornerstone of society, sat neatly on the shelf between hemorrhoids and war in the index of things one does not discuss at tea. And yet, the wedding industry, as industrial as it could be in an era where dresses weighed as much as small livestock and wedding feasts involved more pigeons than plates, was booming. Girls, often no older than the Eat Homicides, bonnet they'd been gifted last birthday, were encouraged to become experts in appearing slightly demure, light-headed under chandeliers, and vastly ignorant of anything having to do with logistics, shall we say. Not just the biological kind, though that too, but of responsibilities, inheritances, even what marriage might mean outside of flowers and cake. Part of this silencing strategy was a deep cultural investment in something called modesty, which in practice meant a young woman could know the migration patterns of alpine goats, but not what her future husband's job was, or how her legal rights, spoiler, very few, would shift the moment she signed her name or made her mark on one very serious-looking bit of parchment. Girls learned about marriage in the same way one learns about deep-sea anglerfish, through myths, cautionary tales, and uncomfortable metaphors. Aunts might refer to it as joining one's fortune, or entering into the fold, or, most confusingly, fulfilling one's role in the divine order, which was code for many things, none of them particularly helpful when standing at the altar and trying to remember who was supposed to speak next. Why the silence, you ask? Why the great historical hush? Let's drift, gently now, into the drawing rooms and dressing chambers of Georgian England, where candlesticks glowed like sleepy halos and lace curtains filtered the outside world into safe, gauzy nonsense. Parents, particularly mothers, often felt that too much knowledge might lead their daughters to make choices, and nothing destroyed a good marriage faster than a girl with opinions. No one wanted that. Not in a system where women were essentially transferred between households like slightly fancier teapots. So, marriage was presented like a surprise party, but one where you are legally bound to the host forever, and the cake is made of responsibility. The legal landscape didn't help. Under the structured lunacy of coverture laws, a married woman ceased to be a legal person in her own right. Anything she owned, whether it was a chest of linens or a conveniently located tower, was instantly scooped up by her husband upon marriage. And heavens, was that not romantic? A man who could, with just a ceremony and an ill-fitting ring, take complete fiscal control over another human being. Ah, love. So perhaps, in their own bizarre and befuddled way, the parents were protecting their daughters from knowing they were about to walk into a system designed less like a partnership and more like a legal trap with fancy drapes. There were, of course, exceptions. Some rogue mothers spilled tea in both the literal and metaphorical sense. A rebellious few might whisper truths behind fans at garden parties, small truths passed like smuggled letters. Aphra Behn, the Restoration playwright and notorious teller of it like it was, warned women through drama and dialogue about the traps of marriage. But not everyone had access to the theatre, especially not those tucked away in the countryside, practicing how to faint prettily and never ask too many questions. Even etiquette books, which were the closest thing to Google at the time except with more mentions of gout, avoided clarity. They offered plenty on how to seat your guests and fold linen napkins, but very little on how to negotiate with a husband who preferred the company of his wigmaker to his wife. And so, daughters went forth, a little dazed, a little thrilled, and entirely uninformed. They stepped into arranged futures with corsets tightened and expectations vague, hopeful in the way only someone unaware of their rights can truly be. But before we drift too deep into the sighs and silences of the marital veil, let's pause beneath the candle shimmer of a long-forgotten ballroom. There, a young bride turns slowly in her satin shoes, wondering, quietly, curiously, what exactly she's agreed to. And it is there, in that tender moment of dreamy bewilderment, that we float gently onward toward what comes next, when the wedding ends and the real mystery begins. By the time young ladies of the 18th century reached marriageable age, which hovered somewhere between she just learned embroidery and quick before her beauty fades, their knowledge of what marriage entailed was often thinner than a lace glove. Discussions of affection, desire, or the steamy drama of cohabitating with a man who, until that point, had likely only ever grunted at church socials, were deemed, how shall we say, unfitting for feminine ears. Instead of practical briefings, mothers offered cryptic advice like, a wife must close her eyes and open her heart, or, even more troublingly, obedience is the golden thread in the fabric of matrimony. These were not so much instructions as they were poetic riddles, ones that, unfortunately, never came with diagrams or footnotes. Now, it must be said, avoidance was often wrapped in the gauze of virtue. A properly raised daughter was supposed to be innocent, entirely unsullied by the gritty details of what awaited in the marital chamber, which was often described vaguely as the realm of duty, or where the linens go to weep. For parents, the idea of explaining marriage properly was as uncomfortable as explaining how butter was made while holding a live cow. But, you may whisper sleepily, wasn't that impractical? Astoundingly so. Imagine preparing your daughter for a long sea voyage, teaching her how to wear the bonnet, smile at the captain, and pack lavender sachets, while admitting that she'll be on a boat for months, in storms, with rats and a husband. And yet, many mothers carried this tradition of silence like a badge that said, I too was confused on my wedding night, and so shall my daughter be. These were generational heirlooms of bewilderment, and they were passed on with pride. Even accomplished women, ladies who could recite Virgil, embroider battle scenes, and faint with theatrical precision, were left to deduce married life from overheard gossip, Shakespeare plays, and the mysterious instructions of their governess, who, if you caught her between glasses of port, might drop something scandalously human like, a good wife must never lock the bedroom door, but she may hide the brandy. Fathers, predictably, had even less to say. Emotionally, they were about as available as a grandfather clock. Their paternal contribution was primarily offering a resigned nod and enough gold for a decent dowry. Some would awkwardly clear their throats and say things like, he has 3 horses, Eliza. The rest you'll figure out. This diffident silence wasn't just an English quirk either. Across Europe and parts of early America, the cultural consensus was that young women were delicate angels, not to be burdened with earthly mechanics. That those mechanics involved their long-term survival, happiness, and an elaborate dance of complicated corset removals. Well, shh. When marital disappointment inevitably arrived, often on the heels of a mismatched union with a man who believed conversation was negotiable and socks were optional, wives turned to others for counsel. Chief among them, housemaids, midwives, and the occasional great aunt who had once scandalously married for love and now wore coloured stockings. And still, in parlours and on walks, the silence persisted. Marriage, when described, was spoken of as a duty, a religion, a woman's highest calling, as long as you didn't ask how it worked. One had to discover it for oneself, as if marriage were a mysterious forest that every girl trudged into blindfolded, encouraged only by the distant call of, someone your husband plays cards with seems happy enough. But it wasn't all grim. Within this perplexing silence, Young brides sometimes discovered the joy of shared conspiracy, wives whispering in gardens, sisters giggling behind closed doors, nannies slipping seditious advice between lullabies. There was wisdom there, warm and passed hand to hand, even if the gatekeepers had swallowed the key. And sometimes, just sometimes, someone dared to say aloud, "It's nothing like what Mother said, and everything like what the cat did to the towel last spring." But hush now. We've wandered through whispering drawing rooms and the deep, bewildered sighs of teacup girls grown into mystery-bound wives. Let's draw the curtains tight, for another chapter stirs just over the horizon, a place where rings don't always mean roses, and the politics of marriage reveals yet another layer of frilly, embroidered confusion. Somewhere around the late 18th century, a curious thing happened in drawing rooms and parlors across Europe. The conversation turned decisively away, especially when young daughters asked questions. The question, the one dreaded, more than any inquiry about algebra or goat's milk shortages, was simple. What does it mean to be married? At this point, mothers often blinked twice, stared into the middle distance, and suddenly remembered they had to check on the gooseberry jam. Fathers vanished behind newspapers so large they could have doubled as stage curtains. And grandmothers busied themselves with knitting the same square of scarf for the third consecutive year. The truth is rather comical and also strategic. No one explained marriage because no one quite agreed on what it actually was, let alone how to sell it convincingly to curious girls. By this time, marriage among the gentry had become less of a romantic entanglement and more of a contract negotiation, preferably one with good lighting, a respectable solicitor, and at least 2 tea breaks. But try telling a dreamy 12-year-old girl that her future was a fiscal alliance based largely on sheep, banknotes, and property inheritance, and watch her excitement tumble like a Georgian souffle. So silence prevailed. But society still had to prepare these girls somehow, hence the rise of accomplishments. These were a vague collection of ladylike skills that included, but were not limited to, embroidery, watercolor painting, fainting strategically, and playing the harp with such dedication it was a wonder the strings didn't flee the instrument in protest. These accomplishments were not useful in any tangible sense. No one was ever going to rescue a marriage by sketching a particularly realistic goose or reciting a sonnet just loud enough for the mother-in-law to hear. But they were designed to give the illusion of preparedness. A girl who could recite Latin poetry while balancing china on her lap must surely be ready to run a household of 20 servants who rarely made eye contact and always insisted the chimney was someone else's responsibility. Daughters were, of course, not completely oblivious. They noticed how marriages worked, or rather, didn't. They saw their mothers reciting entire paragraphs of polite silence at dinner. They witnessed their fathers speaking almost exclusively in weather updates. They noticed that affection, if it existed at all, was something exchanged in brief nods like letters passed beneath a desk. Still, no one talked about it. Polite avoidance became an art form. Courtship rituals took center stage, often involving a complex series of coded fans, glances from behind lace veils, and dances so rigidly choreographed that one misstep could accidentally betroth you to the third eldest son of a baronet with gout. All this tiptoeing created a society where feelings were implied rather than described. Marriage was a station you arrived at with great ceremony, and very little idea of what you were supposed to do once disembarked. It was less romance, more government bureaucracy with better outfits. Even literature joined the charade. Most novels of the EE time-skirted around what happened after marriage, usually ending right at the altar with a triumphant happily ever after, before inspiration dramatically refused to go any further. After all, what was romance compared to estate taxes? But perhaps the most revealing moment lay in the objects young women carried into marriage. Dowries arrived in trunks. Hope chests were packed with lace, silverware, and slightly reproachful linens embroidered by stern aunts. But the most symbolic item may have been the etiquette manual, a book so thick and so devoid of actual advice you could use it as ballast on a merchant ship. These books declared with great verbosity that a wife must be agreeable, well-tempered, and never speak in haste. They were remarkably consistent in never explaining things like how to politely inform your husband that you do, in fact, have opinions, or that his new hunting dog has chewed the velvet curtains again. Even beneath the rules and silence, girls often sensed there was more to this mysterious institution, but their questions were gently redirected to painting or piano, or perhaps some needlepoint which, by coincidence, would leave one much too occupied to inquire further. And so, generation after generation, the dance continued, waltzing around the topic of matrimony as if it were a sleeping dragon best left undisturbed. Some dragons, however, do stir eventually, especially when confronted by curious minds and quiet rebellions sealed inside diary pages and whispered conversations at the back of embroidery class. As the candle flickers lower and the twilight deepens, one may begin to wonder, if no one told the daughters the truth, who told the mothers? And what, exactly, were they told? Let's see where this silence leads next, as we drift gently into the stories stitched just beneath the hems of wedding gowns and etiquette guides. In the slippery grey fog of the 18th century, a place where candles squeaked when you lit them and powdered wigs outnumbered honest conversations 10 to 1, there existed a peculiar phenomenon: polite society's absolute refusal to tell young women what on earth marriage actually was. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking this oversight was a harmless omission, a quirky little habit, like calling a chamber potter necessary, or pretending Lord Bartholomew didn't snore through the opera. But in truth, it was more like wrapping a mystery novel in lace, handing it to your daughter on her wedding day, and whispering, "Best of luck, dear." It's mostly metaphors. Young ladies, especially those of the wealthier, more refined classes, were raised on a fragile diet of pianoforte lessons, embroidery, French verbs they'd never use, and the sharp, unspoken knowledge that their entire lives were building toward the event. Marriage, capital M. It hovered over them like a pleasant but vaguely threatening cloud. From the moment they could hold a teacup without sloshing it onto the rug, they were delicately groomed into the role of future wives. They were encouraged to be agreeable, yet modest, conversational, but never opinionated. A young lady in 1742 could tell you the difference between satin and taffeta with military accuracy, but ask her anything more physiological than how long to steep a rosehip tisane, and she'd go as red as a beet with a secret. The truth is, no one wanted to be the one to say it. Say what, you ask? The physical side of marriage. The entirely human, fairly natural, occasionally giggle-inducing acts which occur, typically, once the cake has been sliced, the chamber musicians have gone home, and everyone's pretending the innkeeper didn't just wink at the bridegroom. Mothers didn't want to explain it. They would rather reline a corset 12 times than utter that sacred trifecta: eggs, wombs, husbands. Fathers downright vaporized if you so much as mentioned the word desire. Governesses would mutter something about, "Beatrix, dear, you'll understand in time," and then flee to the stables for a restorative sob. Instead, knowledge was meted out in the obscure and often terrifying form of euphemism. Advice like, "Just lie still and think of the crown," or "Your wifely duty will become clear with experience," made everything sound less like a romantic partnership and more like an unpleasant maritime ritual. It wasn't just England, oh no. Across Europe and beyond, modesty was weaponized with the precision of a well-oiled cannon. In 1790s, France, elite girls knew how to decapitate a pomegranate and recite Latin verse, but couldn't identify their own anatomy on a diagram. In feudal Japan, noble families would provide scrolls with poetic instructions, often involving metaphors about cherry blossoms, rivers, and mysteriously, carp. It wasn't until after the honeymoon that many brides discovered the carp was not in fact literal. And remember, while daughters remained safely in the dark, Sons were quietly escorted to drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs where aging uncles with a past gave them slightly too explicit advice over a brandy and a smirk. It created what historians might generously call a knowledge imbalance. The first night of marriage for these young women was not the blissful union described in sentimental novels. It was more often a confusing, occasionally alarming, sequence of events, followed by a knock at the door with a helpful maid inquiring if madam required anything for the linens. And here's the curious part. People thought it was better this way. There was a deep-set belief that ignorance preserved chastity, modesty, and the misty-eyed concept of a woman's virtue. If they don't know it exists, one 18th century etiquette columnist essentially argued, they can't go looking for it. Of course, this logic falls apart if you've ever met a teenager, or anyone with a curious mind. So brides went into marriage blindfolded by propriety, bumping around in the dark of social expectations, occasionally bruising themselves on metaphor and moral panic. And yet, through all of this, through alarming revelations, coded scrolls, and the world's most awkward honeymoon conversations, women carried on. They stitched emotional wisdom into the seams of their lives. They learned, often quietly and on their own, how to navigate the strange sea they'd been tossed into. The fog, ever so slowly, began to lift. And somewhere, just after the first awkward breakfast as husband and wife, came the realization. Perhaps it was time we stopped calling advice delicate, when that really meant non-existent. Which brings us, ever so gently, to the curious case of 19th century marriage guides, and how some of them try to fix the problem by encouraging a helpful diagram or two, with varying success. The year was 1643, and in a cottage somewhere in Wiltshire, a mother was embroidering a daffodil so thoroughly that even the daffodil itself, out in the garden, would have conceded defeat. Her teenage daughter stood nearby, holding a lump of sheep's wool, looking from her mother's needlework to the wool, back to the stitching, and then, with excruciating courage, asked, "Mama, what is it exactly that happens after one gets married?" The daffodil remained silent. So did her mother, for just a bit too long. This, you see, was the very essence of the problem. An entire generation of daughters had questions, and an entire generation of mothers was too busy aggressively darning socks and their own blushes to answer them. Now, to be fair, it wasn't that these women lacked knowledge. They knew very well what marriage entailed, both practically and, shall we say, anatomically. No, their reluctance was not due to ignorance, but to a well-honed practice in the art of euphemism, denial, and distraction. You might imagine a society where frank conversations flourished, but this was 17th century England, where the words table leg were sometimes deemed indecent, and furniture was occasionally dressed more modestly than the people using it. If someone had managed to invent the concept of a Victorian repressed sigh 2 centuries early, it would be here, in fields of lavender and silence. Instead of honest talk, young girls were handed books. Not helpful ones, mind you, but the sort famously titled things like The Virtuous Maiden's Path to Marital Grace and Domestic Enlightenment, which offered equal parts dense scripture, confusing metaphors, and a near-choking amount of garden imagery. A euphemism-laced guide might suggest that marriage was like planting a rose in one's orchard, which, however poetic, left young girls nervously staring at their father's apple trees and wondering if horticulture was inherently scandalous. There was also the matter of the marriage chest, a fine piece of furniture, where a girl would store her linens and future wifely items. It was lavishly carved, tightly sealed, and full of mysterious grown-up fabrics, which is to say it was a perfect metaphor for how much she was expected to know about her own destiny. Ornate, opaque, and utterly confusing. And still, the mothers sewed. There was something about embroidery that served as both meditation and excuse. Threading a needle required such firm concentration that, conveniently, it meant no eye contact with inquisitive daughters. If you tried to raise an eyebrow mid-question, she'd say, "Child, you'll ruin my stitch," a subtle cue that curiosity was best redirected. But despite all this polite evasion, evidence suggests young women often figured things out on their own, somehow. Human history is filled with whispered conversations in shadowy corners of kitchens, where older sisters gave hushed advice that made absolutely no sense. "He will pluck thy petals," one might say in earnest, leaving the bride-to-be with a vague discomfort and a sudden allergy to daisies. Meanwhile, the church wasn't helping either. The clergy had a knack for muddling clarity. Sermons invoked the sanctity of marriage with such fervor that the practical bits were swallowed in holy metaphor. If a girl ever cornered a vicar with the same bold question, "But what actually happens after the vows?" she'd get a lot about divine union, spiritual harmony, and becoming as one flesh, which is precisely the kind of statement that answers nothing but somehow sounds too detailed. And so, in the absence of facts, myths burrowed in. Some girls believed their first night would involve a special kind of kiss that unlocked further wifely duties. Others were warned by aunties who meant well but had a personal feud with joy. In these stories, marriage began with an awkward banquet, followed by vague suffering and the eternal cleaning of someone else's boots, humor, however, muffled by lace. And prayer books was not entirely lost. Among themselves, girls developed codes that made them giggle. Euphemisms like pressing linens or kissing the candle out began to circulate. No one quite knew what they meant, especially since pressing linens was already a thing people genuinely did. But the mystery itself became a shared laugh. A gleeful wink passed through generations like a well-guarded joke. And so, when Mary of Wiltshire lowered her wool and asked again, tentatively, "Mama, do husbands and wives live in the same bed?" Her mother looked up. She smiled softly. "Yes," she said, "but not on the same side." And that was all she'd get that day. All of which brings us gently and curiously to what came next in the parlors and parlance of the upper classes, in the flower-fringed drawing rooms of the 18th century, where canaries sang from gilded cages and pianofortes waited patiently in sun-dusted corners. Something deeply mysterious hummed just beneath the lace-trimmed surface of life. It was a mystery observed, but rarely explained, and never, heaven forbid, discussed at tea. It was marriage. Now, if you were a young lady of above-average curiosity, but tragically average fortune, you'd grow up knowing that one day you would be married, that, at some point, your hand would be handed to someone, and that you'd be expected to smile politely while doing it. But what that actually entailed, precisely how marriages functioned, or malfunctioned, and why Aunt Millicent never makes eye contact with Uncle Gerard, well, that was all left enshrouded in elaborate metaphors involving rosebuds, doves, and things that happen after the third waltz. The reason for this veil of polite confusion was not, as one might assume, laziness or a lack of affection. It was sheer terror. Parents, particularly mothers, feared that should they dare to explain the nature of marriage too clearly, their daughters would do something reckless like say no. And so girls were gently ushered toward the aisle, equipped with an education in embroidery, the Psalms, and the art of not fainting in public. But knowledge of what happened after one said, "I do," that was left to whispered hints, the occasional eyebrow raise, and cryptic passages in medical pamphlets hidden in the back of the linen closet. Although, to be fair, medical pamphlet is a generous term. In 1765, one London writer published a guide titled "On the Duties of Matrimonial Intimacy" that, after 27 polite pages about the reproductive habits of ferns for some reason, concluded that marital affection should be conducted, quote, "with the lights extinguished and conversation at a minimum." It's hard to imagine a young bride feeling reassured. Indeed, wedding nights became notorious for their combination of confusion and disappointment. especially among girls raised in households where tablecloths had more emotional range than their fathers. Historians have noted countless diary entries from new wives within aristocratic families, where the tone lies somewhere between perplexed zoologist and lightly traumatized pen pal. Take, for instance, Lady Eliza Winthrop, who in 1783 wrote a letter to her sister the morning after her nuptial debut. She described her husband's behavior as, and I quote, energetic but confused, like a spaniel attempting to play the harpsichord. And this from a woman who'd been raised to think of intimacy as a polite handshake that occasionally results in twins. One must understand the broader cultural context, of course. Modesty was considered a virtue so sacred that even the word leg was sometimes considered too scandalous to utter in mixed company. The alternative: limbs. Or if you were feeling particularly poetic, lower extremities. So you can imagine that full sentences regarding the actual mechanics of a marital relationship were about as common as dragons in Yorkshire. In this warped silence bloomed a kind of folklore among girls. The older cousins and boarding school roommates would whisper legends, part horror story, part myth, of what lay ahead. Sometimes there were horses involved, metaphorically. Sometimes cucumbers. Sometimes it was all just too stupefying to make sense. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of, all this withholding of knowledge, the marriage machine churned on. Dance cards were filled. Fathers arranged dowries with the steely focus of lawyers, and daughters continued to practice walking slowly toward imaginary grooms. Because to be married, no matter how mysterious the business was, meant security. Status. The right to finally wear feathers in your hair and talk about your husband's gout without shame. But as romantic as the word mystery sounds whispered over candlelight, it rarely comforts those who find themselves neck-deep in it. Many women of the era spent their first years of marriage fumbling through an emotional fog, guided less by love than by inherited etiquette and the ever-present pressure to produce an heir, or at least a reason to stay busy at social functions. Still, there were exceptions. Pockets of candor where a knowing aunt, bold enough to have read French novels and survived, might slip some enlightening wisdom to a niece. But these were rare, covert interventions, usually disguised as warnings about men who drink too much claret. As twilight dims on this chapter of historical guesswork and matrimonial mystery, our eyelids grow heavier. Let us now drift toward the softer glow of what came after a wife became a wife. Not the wedding night, heavens no, we're far too delicate for that, but the subtle, secret ways these women learned to navigate their new roles, holding on to bits of themselves as they tiptoed through candlelit corridors of wifely duty. There is a certain peculiar charm to 18th century etiquette manuals, the kind penned by men in powdered wigs and women who hadn't smiled in a decade. These self-important tomes, often titled things like The Complete Gentlewoman's Conduct or Virtue in Every Stitch, taught girls how to curtsy, embroider an entire cathedral onto a handkerchief, and, somehow, entirely avoid learning what a husband actually was. Within their crinkly pages, their advice ranged from delightfully rigid to borderline delusional. Young ladies, these books claimed, were like delicate flowers, though oddly, one's expected to scrub floors, birth 11 children, and perform small talk for 6 continuous hours at a time. They were to be obedient, modest, and cheerful, all while knowing exactly nothing about what marriage entailed, especially the why of it all. It wasn't for lack of available material. There were sermons, there were lectures, there were dinner parties dedicated to the subject. But when it came to daughters, there existed a practiced silence, the kind only generations of careful denial can accomplish. Mothers mastered the art of blinking meaningfully when certain words were uttered. Fathers muttered, "Ask your mother," before vanishing entirely behind newspapers or gardening shears. Your average Georgian drawing room contained more emotionally repressed subtext than a Jane Austen novel at a funeral. You see, marriage was less a romantic union and more a barter system that somehow took the form of a poem. Maidens were told to marry sensibly, preferably before their teeth began to resemble a certain instability, as one 1798 etiquette writer euphemistically warned. But what sensible meant was subject to bizarre interpretation. At its core, marriage was a legal transaction wrapped in lace. A gentleman could acquire not just a bride, but access to her dowry, her family's social connections, and perhaps a country estate slightly damp in winter. For the bride, it was a bit like leaping into an ocean because you were told the water contained swans, and never being taught how to swim. Oh yes, it was beautiful and poetic, except when it was extremely confusing and occasionally tragic. The real skill of the era's marriage instruction lay not in what was said, but what was gloriously, awkwardly not said. Take, for example, the wedding night, that enigmatic and whispered concept which young ladies were sometimes told was the final embroidery of love's tapestry. A phrase that sounds beautiful until you realize she's absolutely baffled and genuinely wondering if the tapestry requires scissors. There were, in truth, a handful of bold souls who tried to bridge this gap. Occasionally, a brave aunt, usually unmarried and suspected of being in possession of secrets no one dared ask about, might corner an unsuspecting niece the day before her wedding and say something like, "Men are curious creatures, be gentle, and don't lock the door." Not exactly a comprehensive guide. The widespread silence wasn't born of cruelty. It was a defense mechanism built from generations of cultural discomfort. For centuries, any discussion of that part of marriage whispered of impropriety. Even the sturdiest matron was terrified of accidentally summoning a scandal simply by explaining the mechanics. Better to pretend it would all simply work itself out. This left generations of young women riding side saddle into a life they weren't prepared for, armed with good posture, excellent stitching skills, and a vague hope that their husband was at least kind. Love might bloom, or it might not. There were certainly poets who swore it could, and they were usually poor and frequently drunk, but they made excellent quotes for wedding invitations. And so the institution of marriage became an elaborate production with veils, dances, cakes, and astonishingly few honest words. A performance where everyone knew the script, but no one had read the final act. Girls were applauded for their modesty, families for their discretion, and society for keeping its collective chin mysteriously high. Still, not all was lost. The whispers did get louder over time. With every generation, a few more eyebrows raised, a few more questions asked, and eventually someone somewhere said, "Perhaps we should tell Margaret something before she's handed to that man in breeches." But that, dear listener, is a stir yet to be properly stirred. For now, rest easy in the knowledge that even history's most confusing silences can be undone, and that sometimes the real secret is they weren't sure what to say either. Which brings us, quietly and curiously, to what happened when young brides learned why none of the questions had ever been answered, usually about 5 minutes after the wedding supper, and long before the cake had settled. If you were a middle-class daughter in early 19th century England, and you wandered into the drawing room with your embroidery still dangling from your lap, only to ask your mother, "What exactly happens once one gets married?" she would likely cough, recoil slightly, and suggest a brisk walk in the garden, possibly in the rain, possibly until your curiosity froze solid. You see, marriage, the grand finale of feminine ambition, the social finish line for eligible daughters, was talked about constantly, but explained with the kind of clarity usually reserved for smoke signals. So naturally, girls pieced together their understanding of marriage the same way one might assemble a jigsaw puzzle without the box, haphazardly and mostly upside down. At its core was the enigmatic wifely duty, a phrase whispered just loudly enough to frighten the inexperienced, but never explained in daylight. Society promoted marriage as the zenith of domestic destiny, a sacred covenant in which the bride gained respectability, a new surname, and the lifelong responsibility of asking her husband where he left his cravat. But when it came to the details of that arrangement, particularly those which occurred behind chamber doors, mothers clammed up faster than oysters at low tide. This prudish reserve wasn't surprising. The Victorian ideal was to preserve what they called female innocence, which, in practice, meant ensuring daughters reached their wedding nights knowing less biology than a taxidermied horse. To tell a young woman about human intimacy was considered not just inappropriate, it was borderline sabotage to her moral character. And so sex, reproduction, and bodily realities were tied up in a linen bundle labeled "hush" to be handed down from mother to daughter, along with the family silver and absolutely no instructions. Education didn't help much. The girls' curriculum in polite society prepared them marvelously for pianoforte recitals and fainting stylishly in high humidity. But it did not, for instance, include a chapter titled, "What Saviour to Expect When You're Expected to Multiply?" If a daughter dared to ask, say during afternoon tea, why Aunt Millicent was suddenly in Florence for 8 months and returned with a nephew, the room would fall into heavy silence, interrupted only by the clinking of saucers and the sound of vague coughing. Even medical texts during this time were bound in secrecy. One popular treatise on women's health managed to include an entire chapter on the uterus without using the word uterus. Just diagrams of clouds and arrows, which frankly could have referred to weather patterns or angel migration. This culture of inhibition reached such heights that even wedding night advice, when offered, was often couched in euphemisms so opaque they resembled cryptic crossword clues. Mothers might say things like, "You must submit cheerfully, for it is your heavenly calling," or, "The less said, the better. But remember to wrinkle the bedsheets." One poor bride wrote in her diary the morning after her wedding, "Something terrible happened. I cannot write it," which is the Edwardian equivalent of posting a TikTok with the caption, "I just realized everything," and then disappearing into the countryside for a fortnight. But as absurd as this all sounds from our modern perspective, the mothers of these eras weren't deliberately trying to confuse or handicap their daughters. In their own well-meaning, goose-feather pillow way, they genuinely thought they were protecting them. The less a woman knew, they believed, the more graceful she would be. And the more graceful, the more marriageable. It was an age where knowledge bore consequences, and innocence, not understanding, was the platinum standard of virtue. Still, one has to wonder how many young brides awoke after the wedding night and thought, "Is this it? Are there pamphlets, support groups? Has anyone checked on Aunt Millicent lately?" Eventually, of course, change arrived, but not in the grand, trumpet-blaring manner one might expect. It crept in quietly, through medical reformers, bold novelists, and brave sisters-in-law who finally elbowed their way around the drawing room and whispered truths over lukewarm cocoa. As evening settles over the long embroidered history of marriage, we find ourselves peeking through a slightly ajar door into the next phase, not of nuptial confusion, but of awakening. When women, bit by clever bit, discovered that understanding wasn't shameful, it was power stitched into petticoats. And as the candle of this chapter flickers low, we tiptoe onward into an attic of advice columns, secret letters, and some rather scandalous sewing clubs. In the warmly candlelit corridors of the 18th century English drawing room, where ladies balanced teacups with more dexterity than most sword fighters had with sabers, there was a peculiar phenomenon as common as powdered wigs or chamomile complaints. It was the great parental pivot, the fateful moment when a daughter innocently inquired what exactly marriage entailed, and her parents, often delicately sipping their 5th cup of heavily diluted scandal, would suddenly find something, anything, fascinating in the embroidery curtains across the room. You see, the practice of not explaining marriage to daughters was less an act of secrecy and more an enthusiastic tradition of practiced avoidance. Courting wasn't so much about getting to know one another as it was a ceremonial waltz of indirect suggestion. Everything about it implied something else, like a theatre production where no one says their lines, but everyone knows when to applaud. Much of this stemmed from a deep belief in propriety, a word which, in its historical context, effectively meant, don't say it, ever. This aversion to specifics had ruled family conversation since at least the Tudor times, where if a young woman asked, "Mother, what exactly happens after I wed?" she would receive a flustered cough, a distracted knitting increase, and a firm lecture on indoor foliage arrangements. Victorian England, ever the inventive purveyor of euphemism, brought this art of avoidance to stratospheric heights. The sheer bureaucracy of innocence was astonishing. Young ladies were expected to arrive at the altar immaculate in every way, including knowledge. They were to understand neither the function nor the mechanics of married life. One popular etiquette manual actually used the phrase, "A lady must carry herself as if unaware she possesses limbs," which does raise a few logistical questions about walking. Parents truly believed that knowledge might ruin a girl's purity, like telling a cake what an oven is. So instead, they relied on hushed metaphors, embroidered moral tales, and a hope that the missionary position came with a sturdy instruction manual. These daughters, while often intelligent, literate, and well-groomed in the complex language of floral symbolism, were expected to enter one of life's most complex partnerships with the informational advantage of a houseplant. To provide some context, imagine planning to be a blacksmith without being told what iron is, or trying to raise goats without knowing what goats look like. Such was the state of marital education. The most comprehensive preparation a girl might receive before her wedding night often came in the form of vague sayings like, "Your husband will guide you," or "Trust in nature." Equally well-meaning aunts might murmur helpful tips such as, "Don't be afraid of shadows," or "Close your eyes and think of the empire." At no point did anyone find it appropriate to say, "There will be anatomy." Ironically, among many tribes and peasant communities deemed unsophisticated by the upper classes, there was sometimes more open dialogue. In rural Russia or parts of West Africa, older women led ceremonies preparing young brides with honesty and support. In contrast, aristocratic English girls were more likely to learn the basic facts of conception from their horses' breeding records. There existed a legendary genre of whispered conversations called that talk, which, in wealthier households, often consisted of no actual talk at all. Occasionally, a mother would hand her daughter a statuette of a swan and say, "You'll understand soon." No one ever knew what the swan meant. It just seemed elegant. What did a young woman do then, with her swirling gowns and even swirlier questions? Many turned to scandalous romance novels, of course. Not for the plot, heavens no, but to discover what anyone actually did in bed. The popularity of forbidden books among debutantes speaks to a secret hunger not just for desire, but for data. It's a strange thing, truly, to be prepared for a life of managing estates, social maneuverings, and childbirth arrangements, yet arrive at the altar, knowing only that one should never remove their gloves too quickly. But what parents lacked in honest instruction, society made up for with a grand, unsolvable puzzle of social expectations. And so, off these young brides went, into the great unknown, carrying their hope, family brooches, and zero practical information. Tomorrow, perhaps, we shall thread this needle further, gliding gently into the shy beginnings of whispered advice, those fumbling, well-meaning lessons passed from one bride to another, under the weight of lace, legacy, and the tremendous pressure of maintaining just the right shade of bashful, with the lace curtain of the 18th century gently fluttering in the drafty drawing room of history. We now drift into the world of matrimonial etiquette books. You know, the kind of dusty tomes tucked behind the good sherry, rarely read, mostly feared, and occasionally used to squash an overly persistent beetle. Before the internet, and even the telephone, people didn't have a search bar to turn to when pondering things like, how do I emotionally connect with my future spouse? Or, why does Uncle Bartholomew keep insisting that elbows at dinner are a gateway to moral ruin? No, Instead, they had conduct literature, thick, serious-looking volumes with titles like The Accomplished Female Instructor or the wildly misleading Hints on the Rise and Progress of Young Women in the Moral Arts. These books were the Pinterest boards of Regency England, except with fewer floral mason jars and more ominous warnings about immodest laughter. They claimed to prepare young ladies for the great adventure of womanhood. That is, being quiet, being decorative, embroidering cushions, and eventually marrying a man approved by your father, your mother, and that deeply suspicious neighbor who hadn't smiled since the last harvest festival. The thing is, as thousands of daughters soon discovered, these marriage guides had a sizable blind spot when it came to the details of what marriage actually involved. They waxed lyrical about duty, virtue, and the importance of a modest bonnet, but they tiptoed very carefully around what actually happened after the organ music stopped and the couple waved goodbye in a decorated carriage. One particularly evasive author, Mrs. Felicity Thistlethwaite, wrote, "The nuptial chamber should be approached with grace, humility, and an understanding heart, all things which were conveniently unclear and likely embroidered onto a pillow." It wasn't necessarily malice that drove this elaborate avoidance of detail. Victorian society, and the decades that crept around it like ivy on a stone manor, held tight to the belief that too much curiosity might cause a woman's delicate constitution to spiral into hysteria. You see, according to some of the best medical minds of 1836, women were essentially emotional soufflés, delightful, but prone to collapse if poked by truth. Parents, unfortunately, had grown up with the same silences. They didn't know how to talk about marriage because no one had talked to them about it either. And thus, the cycle spun on, like a music box playing only the first half of a lullaby. Daughters were meant to learn in time, usually from older sisters, indifferent governesses, or a mysteriously cryptic note slipped into a petticoat on the day of the wedding. Now, if you're wondering what young men were told, it's worth noting that they were often pointed toward manuals with marginally more explanation, but wrapped in the sort of stern, moralistic warnings that suggested any passion at all might summon a bolt of retributive lightning. Of course, human nature being what it is, this lack of clear instruction did not prevent anyone from eventually figuring things out. It just ensured that they did so with confusion, embarrassment, and very little sense of humor. A newlywed in 1842 might stroll hand in hand with her husband through a rose garden, gently, whispering, "So, about last night, was that supposed to happen?" And her husband, who had stayed up the previous evening paging frantically through the husband's moral compass, might mutter, "I believe so," though chapters 9 through 12 were mysteriously glued together. What's perhaps most curious is that despite this enormous cultural quietude, this grand embroidered silence, you won't find a widespread rebellion. There was no parade of daughters refusing to marry until someone explained the actual job description. Instead, these young women, trained from birth to serve tea and suppress questions, stepped dutifully into bridal slippers and pretended they understood everything. Still, some poked at the curtain. Curious minds whispered beneath bed covers, daring to wonder if perhaps Mrs. Thistlethwaite had left a few things out. And when ladies gathered together, perhaps sewing or sipping diluted lemonade, you'd hear veiled hints and cryptic giggles. The occasional, "My dear, if you think marriage is only about muslin and joint banking, you are in for a most energetic surprise." There were always cracks in the ornamented wallpaper, soft rebellions that began not with shouts, but with curious glances, half-laughed questions, and the ancient teenage art of decoding everything your mother refused to say. And somewhere, perhaps in a forgotten diary, locked in a velvet box, a freshly married daughter once wrote, "It seems there is more to it than lace and lemon cakes. Remarkable." I shall revise my embroidery patterns accordingly. As twilight deepens and the candelabra flickers in the halls of memory, we begin to wonder, did these young brides ever find their voices? Or was there another twist in the silent, corseted tale of feminine education, waiting just beyond the next shadowed corridor? By the time the early 19th century rolled around, the notion of marriage was dangling somewhere between a social contract, religious ritual, and a rather inconvenient career change, especially for women. And for daughters coming of age in parlors that smelled faintly of lemon wax and barely used etiquette books, marriage wasn't so much explained as it was implied, heavily, thunderingly, but never quite out loud. And so, like a particularly delicate upholstery fabric, daughters had to absorb adult expectations without ever wrinkling the surface. They learned that marriage involved a man, a house, and an extraordinary number of doilies. They gathered that it required something called dutiful submission, though the actual duties were catalogued with all the clarity of ancient riddles. They might overhear whispers about wifely responsibilities while pretending not to listen behind the embroidery hoop. At finishing schools, which were less about finishing anything and more about polishing girls into agreeable antiques, the curriculum veered suspiciously. Young ladies were taught to dance elegantly, smile nothing too wide, and pour tea with disarming precision. But when it came to what actually happened once the tea set had been packed away and the wedding veil was hung up to dry, the lesson plan got very quiet indeed. Aunts and governesses practiced a kind of poetic obfuscation. One might declare, marriage is a garden, dear. It must be tended with patience and grace. This metaphor, while picturesque, did not explain much beyond the purchase of a good watering can. If the unfortunate daughter pressed for detail, say what kinds of plants and which gardening tools to expect, she would be met with sudden coughs, diverted glances, or a reverent mention of Queen Victoria. Now, Queen Victoria had married Prince Albert in what was widely celebrated as the purest form of matrimonial bliss. Their union was heralded as a model not only for love, but for a kind of private virtue. Paintings showed the Queen gazing fondly at Albert, and Albert gazing fondly at a far-off notion of fatherhood, with only the stiff backdrop of royal wallpaper between them. In truth, Victoria often wrote of her intense fondness for her husband, who was regularly tasked with managing her 9 children, her moods, and the various perils of wearing satin after a certain hour. But what Victorians adored most was the illusion that all was demure and spotless behind closed doors. No need to explain things when everyone agreed not to talk about them. Thus, girls entering into matrimony were expected to pivot gracefully, like actors who'd missed the first half of the script but assumed the rest made sense. For their part, mothers, being the original veterans of romantic mystery, often passed down this tradition of blessed ignorance with just a touch too much enthusiasm. It spared them the awkward logistics of squinting over the corset clasp of the talk. It kept the sacred enigma of womanhood preserved in a velvet-lined box marked "For marriage only," and secretly, many believed that mystery was the ingredient that gave marriage its fizz, or at least its ability to survive Sunday dinners. As for the fathers, well, they treated marriage as one might treat thunder on a summer afternoon. Something loud, frequent, and best left unchallenged. Daughters were advised to marry well, which meant someone with land, teeth, and vaguely liberal voting tendencies. The rest, they'd say, would sort itself out through divine providence and marital wine. Meanwhile, advice columns shimmered with poetic misdirection. Publications like Godey's Lady's Book offered earnest prose, urging women to be moderate in speech, gentle in judgment, and thrifty in sauce. Still, no one ever wrote, "Darling daughter, here's what actually happens when the curtains close." Perhaps society feared that clarity would rip the lace off the illusion, that if girls knew too much, they might look twice at their suitors and notice, gasp, that many of them could not in fact spell candlestick. Yet there were murmurings of change in pockets of Europe and America, ladies of independent thought began slipping pamphlets into tea cozies and gazing at medical diagrams with both horror and curiosity. Slowly, word threaded its way through the hush, sometimes in a dubious novel, sometimes in a friend's scandalous letter written in lemon juice, revealed only by candlelight and sacrilegious giggles. Of course, these quiet revolutions wouldn't reach everyone at once. Many daughters still stood at the threshold of marriage, not knowing whether it would be an opera of love, a business pact, or just a frustratingly large hat collection shared between two nervous people. But as the century drew itself neatly into an envelope, something shifted. A few curious minds had begun to lift the veil, one lace loop at a time. And whether or not they liked what they saw, at least they were finally seeing. Sleep now, gentle listener, and in the next quiet chapter, we may meet the peculiar advice givers who loomed just beyond the parlor door with their scented letters and suspiciously knowing eyebrows. In the late 18th century, nestled beneath the powdered wigs, empire waistlines, and slightly scandalized invitations to tea, sat an increasingly awkward dilemma. No one, and I do mean no one, wanted to explain what marriage actually was to their daughters. Certainly not the parents, who preferred to keep up a thin lace curtain of modesty and blissful ignorance. Certainly not the governesses, who'd rather recite Latin declensions backwards than breathe a word about, well, anything involving trousers. The prevailing belief was simple. Curiosity was dangerous, and knowledge could induce fainting spells, rebellious poetry, or, worst of all, opinions. So mothers looked away, fathers cleared their throats, and daughters received more detailed guidance on embroidery than on what, precisely, awaited them in their matrimonial chamber. In one delightful instance, recorded in a dusty 1794 diary found between a pressed corsage and a moth-eaten cravat, a young woman named Lavinia was told, rather vaguely, that marriage involved a lifetime of shared interests and mutual respect, which, considering she'd been engaged since age 12 to a man 30 years her senior who collected military buttons and never made eye contact, sounded unlikely. Poor Lavinia assumed mutual respect involved taking turns at breakfast toast. To understand this odd silence, we must tug gently on a few threads. First, the idea of innocence in young girls had swollen to mythic proportions. A truly virtuous lady, according to Victorian etiquette manuals, should resemble a swan on a quiet lake, which meant beautiful, graceful, and absolutely silent about anything remotely anatomical. Men, meanwhile, were expected to simply know everything about marriage, as if born with a scroll of secret instructions tucked inside their waistcoat. It was the great contrast of the age. One half of a marriage entered it with encyclopedic scoundrelry, while the other hoped for piano duets and perhaps a rose garden. Then there was the religious element. Much of Europe and American society in the 18th and 19th centuries was steeped in a blend of piety and prudery. Churches tended to treat physical matters of marriage like something one whispered behind velvet curtains, preferably while holding a large, symbolic candlestick. Clergymen advised parents to preserve the modesty of the feminine mind, which sounds noble until you realize it mostly resulted in catastrophically bewildered wedding nights. More than one new bride was known to burst into tears or call for the maid when discovering her husband's idea of consummation involved more than a moonlit dance and matching monograms. And so, whisper by whisper, an entire world trained itself to use euphemisms instead of honesty. Marriage was described as a union of souls, or a lifelong friendship with ceremonial trimmings. The physical realities were referred to as that which occurs between curtains, or the natural act granted by providence, or sometimes, rather mysteriously, simply it. Even the more scientific minds were not immune. A certain 19th century French encyclopedia referred to sex as a necessary, if vulgar, utility of wedlock, which makes it sound less like love and more like plumbing. Some young women, suspicious of all this peony-scented vagueness, did press for answers. In such cases, their mothers might blush furiously, send for chamomile, and declare, "You'll know when it's time." Time, in this case, arrived suddenly, often in a tool veil and a hired carriage. There was one notable exception to this hush-hush world: the informal whisper networks of older maids and chatty aunts with liberal access to sherry. These unofficial educators often dared to explain things more plainly, albeit using metaphors involving spoons, curtains, horses, or occasionally, confusingly, baking. One housemaid named Nellie became legendary for her method of educating brides by painstaking analogy involving sponge cake and chimney flues. No one ever fully understood it, but they did emerge faintly wiser and unusually hungry. Still, perhaps the greatest historical irony is that all this effort to preserve innocence only created sleepless nights and aching confusion. While generations of women embroidered samplers that read, "Virtue is her guide," their real navigation came from trial, error, and whispered advice behind closed doors. But history, as it often does, kept turning silently forward. And as evening settles in like soft lace across a looking glass, you may begin to feel the gentle hush of curiosity settling into dreams. Drift quietly now, for the light in the next room is flickering, and with it, the final secret begins to glow. As night deepens and candles burn low in the imagination, we drift now to the gentle twilight of our peculiar journey through courtship, corsets, and the curious silence of parents afraid to utter the word marriage too loudly in front of their daughters. It's almost as if saying it 3 times could summon a scandal, or worse, a suitor. By the end of the 19th century, society had become an elaborate theatre in which marriage was both the main event and the thing no one wanted to explain to the actors. Young women, swaddled in innocence like decorative pillows, were expected to enter matrimony knowing how to host a garden party, embroider a handkerchief, and perhaps play a Liszt nocturne. But heaven forbid they understand the mechanics of matrimony itself. In drawing rooms and parlors across polite neighborhoods, whether London, Boston, or a small village in the rolling hills of Bavaria, the topic was swaddled in euphemisms and served cold with the tea. Mothers, having once stumbled blindly into matrimony themselves, often handed their daughters the same gauzy blindfold. When pressed with questions, the innocent kind like, "How do babies happen?" or "Why does Cousin Eleanor faint at the sight of Cousin Hugo?" many a Victorian mother resorted to a ladylike coughing fit and a sudden interest in pressing flowers. You see, the industrialization of the 1800s might have brought factories and steam engines, but it hadn't quite managed to modernize family communication. People were still depending on ancient tools like ferocious awkwardness and passing the buck to Aunt Margaret. One legitimate excuse was the cultural belief in feminine purity, a baffling idea that seemed to rest on the hope that if a girl didn't know anything, she'd be easier to marry off and less likely to get any ideas, like thinking for herself. Knowledge, especially biblically sanctioned knowledge, was dangerous in female hands, apparently. Better to tell Miss Euphemia that marriage was just a very long sleepover with a man who paid for things and occasionally needed his socks darned. In the more progressive circles, young brides-to-be might receive a whisper of a marriage manual, whisper being the operative word, as the books were discreetly slid across dressing tables like contraband. With such inviting titles as The Duties of a Wife or What Every Young Woman Should Know But Likely Won't, these delightful tomes offered vague metaphors nestled in layers of botanical allegory. One popular guide instructed brides to lay like the lily neath the gardener's careful tending, our condolences to all the gardeners. And then there were the etiquette books, which could thank Victorian nerves for their proliferation. These books detailed everything from how to write a calling card to how long polite eye contact should last, no longer than the lifespan of a goldfish, apparently. Yet they perplexingly avoided addressing what happened once the groom carried the bride over the threshold and she realized, too late, that "till death do us part" wasn't just poetic. It was a union backed by law, church, and the inescapable horror of shared linens. The silence wasn't all malicious, of course. In many homes, especially among modest families with limited schooling, awkwardness mingled with sincere ignorance. Some parents genuinely didn't know how to explain any of it. So like the moon that politely shines without revealing its own craters, they hoped their daughters would simply figure things out once they got there. After all, if their own mothers hadn't explained it and they'd survived, perhaps that was tradition enough. But survive is not the same as understand. Generations of women entered the bonds of holy matrimony without even a glimmer of what awaited them, physically, emotionally, or contractually. And yet, somehow, the human race carried on, against all odds and royal marriages. Even so, occasionally there was an aunt. There was always an aunt, a rebellious one with a fondness for port wine and a great collection of French novels. She might take a niece aside and, in a whisper broad enough to hear 3 hearths away, say something both maddening and enlightening like, "Just remember, darling, the first night is often the worst, like a souffle that won't rise. But eventually, you learn how to fold the eggs. And what more can be said about the unspoken parts of history? We've tiptoed across centuries of silences, tracing the outlines of what wasn't said, and pieced together the humor underneath. The truth is, marriage remained a riddle, answered not with clarity, but with sighs, lifted eyebrows, and the time-tested hope that love, or at least tolerable companionship, might work out in the end. So now, dear listener, let the past fold gently around you like a woolen cloak, worn and wise, and rich with stories no one dared to say aloud. Drift, if you will, into sleep, with your dreams wrapped in muslin, sealed in wax, and signed yours truly by candlelight. Good night.